Hello, and welcome to Part 2, Lecture 2 of the Marlborough Intro to Medieval Studies class. Today we will be talking about Christian conversion of northern groups. Now, if you remember last time I gave a fairly brief overview of Christianity from the 1st century up to the 4th century and the conversion of Constantine and the making of a sort of Roman imperial Christianity. And then a little bit about how Christianity deals with what happens at the very tail end of that, right? When the Roman Church, or rather, when the Roman Empire begins to run into problems, and the Church has to figure out how to be a church, not in an institutional setting. Well, today we're going to continue that discussion a little bit, and we'll be looking specifically at the ways in which, after the end of real Roman imperial power, the church starts to look to northern groups. They start to look to expansion and conversion beyond Rome's borders and how they deal with that. And one of the main questions that we have to address is, what do we mean by conversion, right? What does it mean when a group decides to convert? How are we certain that a people is Christian? How are we certain that a king is Christian? What does it mean for a certain number of people to be converted? Because they don't think about faith the way we do today. There isn't this personal identity and personal connection that everybody has their own confession, right? Confessionalism is a much later invention. So what does it mean for a group when these chronicles say such and such group or such and such king and his people are all Christian, or are not Christian? How do we interpret that, and what does that mean? And as we'll see, it's a complicated question. For one early example, just to illustrate this, we talked also last time about all of the heresies that get discussed in the 4th century. There's one bishop in the 4th century named Ulfila, who is an Arian bishop consecrated in 341. He's sometimes called the Apostle to the Goths. But when looking closely at his stories, right, the Apostle to the Goths implies that he's going there to convert them and make them Christian. But the story seems to describe that he's actually going to minister to people who are already Christian but living under Gothic rule. So perhaps these are Romans who are living under a Gothic state. It's not clear, but what is apparent is that it's not so simple that he's simply going to convert them, but that he's dealing with people who might have already heard of Christianity. They perhaps know something about it, and this is something that we'll see repeatedly. So first we'll talk for just a minute about the political situation, and the political series of lectures at the beginning will cover this in more detail if you want. But if you remember, in the 6th century, this is when the Eastern Empire under Justinian is really gaining a larger foothold. Justinian consolidates a lot of power and reintegrates legal thinking into his empire. We talked about the Justinianic law codes that he produces. He also consolidates his strength enough in Byzantium that he begins to expand. He goes to fight in North Africa, fights in parts of Italy, and really has pretensions to recreating the large Mediterranean empire of Rome. Now, he doesn't succeed at that, and after his death, the Eastern power wanes a little bit, but there's a hint that that will happen. Now, in Italy, one of the contexts for the church deciding to no longer be a Roman church, we talked about the turn to the Carolingians because of the attack of the Lombards. The Lombards show up in 568 and begin taking different cities. Now, one of the interesting things about the Lombards themselves, they're also an example of this potentially complicated question of conversion. They convert very early on to Catholicism. They've heard of Catholicism possibly before they even enter Italy. They convert under a king named Waco. But then the conqueror of Italy, Alboin himself, converts apparently from Catholicism to Arianism. They eventually convert back to Catholicism, but that'll take a while. So again, if they're Arian, do we as scholars count them as Christian, right? Where do we place people? If Alboin is Arian, does that mean that all of the followers that came with him to Italy are? It's a little like the question we talked about the identity of these groups. Are the people under Alboin, do they all think of themselves as Lombard? Similarly, do they all think of themselves as Arian? And really, we have no idea. And you remember when the Arians Lombards show up, one of the things that the Pope eventually does is ask for help from the Franks. They decide not to ask for help from the Byzantines. And part of this turning towards northern groups is also what gets them more involved in making sure that as many of the people north of the Alps are Christian as possible. Now, really, this starts before those events between 500 and 700. One of the big conversion movements, and certainly one of the most famous, starts with the Pope Gregory the Great. And here's Gregory the Great. This is an image from one of his letters. One of the things he's most famous for is the writing of letters. And if Augustine is known for his sermons, well, Gregory the Great is known for his letters. There are about 800 of them. He also has other works on the moral life, on biblical interpretation. He also consolidates an idea of biblical interpretation that is already there with Augustine and Jerome, who we talked about last time, but he really systematizes it, and it's his way of thinking that becomes the norm through the rest of the medieval period. He looks at biblical interpretation under 4 levels. This is a bit of a tangent, but this is important for understanding Christian theology later, so I'm going to mention it now. He thinks that when you read the Bible, there are 4 levels going on at any one time. There's the historical set of events, and he takes it to be historically true. Jerusalem is a city. Historical events happened there. It was built and sacked and built again, etc. Now, you can also look at it as an allegory, right? You can see the historical Jerusalem as a symbol, perhaps, for the church itself when the church is doing well. What are the things that attack the church or that assail it? That would be the allegorical level. You can also see it as what he refers to as a tropological level, and this is sort of moral instruction where you imagine Jerusalem representing your soul, and you look at the things that make your soul turbulent or at peace. These are instructions for somebody who wants to have a peaceful soul, and you should look at events in the Old Testament as types for how you should treat your soul. What do the patriarchs do in certain situations? That is a way of thinking about how you can lead your life. And the last one is for ascetic instruction. The Bible is a set of instructions for the life of heavenly citizens, how you should prepare for the future life, etc. And then that one also is, like the historical, is a little more obvious. The allegorical, fairly obvious. The tropological is really a slightly different way of thinking, but one that is important for theology that Gregory the Great really consolidates. And he's so influential. He's one of the doctors of the church, one of the church fathers, like the people we talked about last time. But he gets referred to by monks in particular as our Gregory or my Gregory, as if they are personally associated with them. There are very warm feelings expressed towards him. He's known as the Pope who gives us Gregorian chant. There's a famous image of the Holy Ghost in the form of a bird singing Gregorian chant into his ear, and he then has it written down. Now, Gregorian chant's not actually written down for another couple of 100 years, but he does do a lot of liturgical systemization. So there's a way in which he begins to set the church on the course that will lead to the writing down of chant, although he is not personally responsible. He's the patron saint of musicians, singers, students, and teachers, which, who wouldn't want to be those 4 things? So, maybe we should feel fairly warmly towards Gregory the Great. People feel so positively disposed towards him, actually, that Calvin, the reformer in the 16th century, Calvin declares him to be the last good pope, which is fairly high praise from Calvin. But for our purposes today, talking about conversion, one of the most important things about Gregory is his interaction with the conversion of England. Now, he's born in 540, and he grows up in a time period and takes over after a century of a lot of war. This is partly due to Justinian's invasions of Italy, but also the appearance of the Lombards. He's growing up in a population, a lot of whom no longer speak Latin particularly. They're beginning to speak what will become Italian, right? Sort of vernacular languages. People are not familiar with the Latin classics. In contrast, Augustine grows up around people who are all educated Latin speakers. Obviously not everybody is educated, but many of the people he knows certainly. And this is not true for Gregory the Great. And then it's 578 when Gregory the Great sends an envoy to Rome to ask for military help against the Lombards, and they refuse. So he's already in this position of thinking about his position in the church without the help of the Romans. The church has to survive a potentially chaotic time, and this is the backdrop with which he then turns towards the missionizing of England. Now, the story that gets told, and a lot of this comes from the Venerable Bede, who we'll come back to in a second. The Venerable Bede is a major writer in English history, and his book, The Ecclesiastical History of the English People, is a source not only for this narrative of conversion, but also he reprints a lot of the letters of Gregory himself. So, according to the Venerable Bede, at one point Gregory the Great is walking through Rome, and he sees a group of little boys. Sort of weird to tell it that way in the modern Catholic context, but there you go. This is what they say. He sees this group of boys who apparently have been captured from the Anglo-Saxons and are being sold as slaves. And he makes the Latin pun. He asks who they are, and he's told that they are Angles, right, from Anglo-Saxons, which in Latin is Angli. And he says, non Angli sed angeli, so not angles, but angels. He thinks that they are perhaps worth saving and quite beautiful. Again, don't think too hard about the modern Catholic context, I imagine. And so he sets up a group of people to travel north to convert the Anglo-Saxons. Now, straight away we should note that although he sends this group north to convert the Anglo-Saxons, England was familiar with Christians. The Britons who were there under Roman rule had become ostensibly Catholic with the Romans themselves, and there were groups of Catholics there. And we'll find that in a couple of these narratives of conversion. So it's not as if they're going to convert in this wholly new place where nobody has ever heard of Christianity. They're going to convert a group that is now ruling over another group that was at one point Christian, and this group has intermingled with the Christians, but they are not necessarily Christian themselves, and so that's who this mission is being sent to. Now, the mission is led by St. Augustine of Canterbury. This is very different than the Augustine of Hippo. They're both quite famous Augustines. Here you can see the image from the Bayeux Tapestry. You can go look that up if you want. It's quite a famous tapestry about the history of England. It's really fabulously detailed and amazing, and one could talk about it for a long time, but I won't at the moment. But this is the image of St. Augustine himself heading off and arriving in England with his group of 12. It's very Christological, right? There's St. Augustine. He brings along 12 sort of apostles to go with him, so that makes him look very much like Christ going to missionize with a group of missionizers around him, and they are going to go and convert. And on the other side here, you see the title page from the Venerable Bede, who I mentioned. This is the text where both all of the following quotes come from, and much of what we know. Now, he cites, not unlike the conversion, that there are Christians already there. Bede himself is citing an earlier source, Gildas, which is about the Britons. It is about the people who were already Christian. But Bede cites it and is writing the history of the English people, the ecclesiastical history of the English Anglorum, right? So of the Angles and of the Anglo-Saxons, which is who he is most concerned with. Now, one of the things that we see in the letters, whenever Augustine has a question about conversion, he sends a letter back to Gregory, and Gregory responds. And Gregory's attitude towards conversion is a fairly new one. There are earlier writers talking about conversion there's one in the context of the Arian church where they say, if you have a church there that's an Arian church and it was consecrated as an Arian church, you can never use it. You should just leave it to rot and build a Catholic one, even right next door. And if you think about that in the context of these old Roman cities, you have large buildings being left to crumble. Now, we don't know if that was actually followed in a lot of instances, but that was the suggestion in some cases. And if you also remember the Donatist controversy, that Augustine of Hippo, the other Augustine, wrote about. He attacks the Donatists as heretics, but the Donatists were saying that if you had apostatized, if you had said at one point you were not Christian, you couldn't go back to being Christian, right? So there's a question about how high to set the Christian bar, essentially. And this is a question that's still with us, right? It's a question that still exists in a lot of churches. And if you think about ecumenical councils today, a really good example of this might be the Anglicans or the Episcopalians in the U.S., but the Episcopalians and the Lutheran Church are now in communion, right? They had to have talks and discussions about what that meant and how they would allow it and under what circumstances. But they've now decided that if you are baptized in a Lutheran church, you can go to an Episcopal church and take communion and then go back to your Episcopal church. So they've decided that the bar for your participation is the same in both churches, which is a fairly big deal. But that's similar to what they're arguing about at this point, right? Where do you set the bar? When do you decide that somebody is the right sort of Christian or Christian enough? Even the difference between Christian and pagan is open to interpretation. So contrary to this earlier statement about letting the churches crumble, Gregory's attitude is quite open. Gregory all but says, and actually at one point he basically does say, if they have a building they're using, just make sure you clear out the pagan symbols and put a cross there and you're done. You don't have to change anything. He doesn't say that sacred groves should be torched or that anything should happen to these previous sites. He basically says they need a crucifix and you're done. And that's good enough. So he has a very low bar to conversion and a very, I don't want to say a low bar, right? Because he still takes it seriously. Obviously he's Pope. He takes his Catholicism very seriously. But he is much more accepting of a diversity of Christian practice. Even if he wants people to all be Christian of one form or another. And you can see this in what happens as Augustine of Canterbury moves through England. Now his first major convert is Ethelbert of Kent, and Bede describes the king's initial response. The king and Augustine of Canterbury talk, and the king says, "Your words and promises are fair, but they are new to us and of uncertain import, and I cannot approve of them so far as to forsake that which I have so long followed with the whole English nation. But because you are come from far into my kingdom, and, as I conceive, are desirous to impart to us those things which you believe to be true and beneficial, we will not molest you, but give you favorable entertainment and take care to supply you with the necessary sustenance, nor do we forbid you to preach and gain as many as you can to your religion." So in this instance, we see a king not converting, but giving leave to proselytize to his people. Now, interestingly, this really does mirror what we see with Constantine. Constantine allows Christianity, and possibly for the same reason. Ethelbert of Kent's wife, Bertha, turns out is a daughter of Cheribert, who is a Merovingian king, in one of the Frankish kings. She had brought a chaplain with her named Liudhard, and she had actually restored a church, right? So there are churches from Roman times, and she had restored one of these just east of Canterbury and dedicated it to St. Martin of Tours, who is a major patron saint for the Merovingian royal family. He's still a major saint today, but a saint of the city of Tours in southern France. Ethelbert himself, although he is a pagan, allows his wife to continue worshiping God in her own way. She has this chaplain with her. She's restored a church, which again was a church for Christians who were there previously. So it's not necessarily surprising that Ethelbert of Kent would say, sure, go ahead, preach. We already have Christians here in some sense. This happens again when they move out of Kent, when they eventually get to Northumbria, further north. Edwin, the king of Northumbria, urged by his Christian wife, Ethelberga, and by the bishop Paulinus, eventually converts. And this is according to Bede himself. Now, Bede really plays up the position of St. Augustine. St. Augustine is a big hero of Bede. But at multiple points, he's noting the presence of Christians already there. In many instances, it looks very much like what we talked about with Constantine and Augustine, who have Christian mothers who are already urging them to convert. In this case, it tends to be kings' wives, right? They've married either important members of the group of Britons who are there, many of whom are Christian, or they've married, in one case, a Frankish princess who is coming from an already Catholic kingdom. So, contrary to the image we sometimes have of conversion by force, right? This is a great example of both a fairly flexible conversion, and in this case sanctioned by the Pope himself, who says, no, whatever we need to win converts, we can let them practice in their own way. We can be somewhat flexible about this. And they go to a place that itself has flexible practice, where you find pagans doing the same thing for Christians in England. And so there's a sense in which the whole conversion of the Anglo-Saxons is relatively smooth sailing. Now, there are a couple of stories of conflict in Bede, but really the largest story actually comes down to a conflict between the Irish church, and the Irish had been converted for over a century at this point, and in fact had sent some of their own monks from the north to convert some of the people in the Anglo-Saxon regions. So this conflict coming up in Bede at what's called the Synod of Whitby, where they're arguing about the dating of Easter and uniform liturgical practice between the English church and the Irish church, in some sense, it makes Bede's whole text not sound like a text of conversion, but rather one of identifying and unifying with Rome, and moving away from the Irish church, because there were obviously already Catholics in Ireland, and so there's a way in which this is a dispute between two different Catholic groups, rather than simply the conversion of English people. Although, as I say, and as I read about Ethelbert of Kent and Edwin of Northumbria, there are real conversion moments. This also sets up, and this will be important throughout the later medieval period, and particularly just post-medieval in the 16th century, they set up the practice of going directly to the king and trying to convert the king. And there's some assumption, we talked about this before, Constantine is sort of the symbol of this, but you see this playing out in England, that if you can get the king to convert, it's assumed that the people will then convert. And even if not all of them do, that they will slowly. That you are out to convert kingdoms, not individuals. And this is something you see really run into a head in the Spanish invasion of Mexico. There are efforts to make the kingdoms Christian. That doesn't succeed. There's a shift away from that when they figure out that it's essentially not going to work. And it doesn't work with either the Aztecs or the Incans. Although they convert huge amounts of people, they for a variety of reasons, it's not just about conversion, but they end up destroying the kingdoms, instituting new governments, and converting individuals rather than converting kingdoms. But in this instance in England, you really see a set of conversions of kings, hoping that the people under them will follow. Now, this flexibility of conversion, which is something that you definitely see in the Anglo-Saxons, you had a bit of in the Irish church as well, can be seen in the Christian objects that they produce. Now, this next slide, these are a couple of artifacts from the really famous funeral ship at Sutton Hoo in England. There was one discovered just a few years ago that is also amazing, but Sutton Hoo is one of the most famous burial ships ever found, and it was an Anglo-Saxon ship where a fairly important person was buried, and they're buried with armor and jewels and art objects and all sorts of things that would be put onto the ship with them. This was all discovered at one archaeological site, and you can see here this pendant with a couple of birds, a large sort of belt or sash buckle, and then this ceremonial helmet. It's what we think of as, and what's sometimes called, an insular style. And you can see, especially in the buckle, the really fine knotwork that we still associate with Celtic knotwork, right? Sort of Irish and Scottish artistic production today continues to have, and particularly when we think of folk artistic production, continues to have that fine knotwork. And you see a little bit of that even in the limbs of the animals. So in some of the gospel books then that get produced in this region after they've become Christian, they continue these artistic patterns and they produce something that looks very different than what is coming out of Rome. And now here you have the Chi-Rho page, and if you remember I mentioned the Chi-Rho or the cross question from Eusebius about what sign it exactly was that Constantine painted on the shields ostensibly. This is a really elaborate Chi-Rho. The Chi is the sort of X-looking shape, and a rho is a little like an R, except the crossbar is flat. And so you see the R with the little human face in the center of it. It's quite a quirky picture. This is a really famous image, probably made a little bit more famous by the Secret of Kells animated movie that came out a few years ago that actually is quite excellent. There's some objection to the portrayal of the Vikings, but it's still a pretty cool movie. And it's about artistic production anyway. It's not exactly about the Vikings. But this is from the Book of Kells and the Lindisfarne Gospels. The Lindisfarne Gospels are actually made in Lindisfarne itself, and Lindisfarne is an island off the coast of Northumberland in England. It's made in a monastery there to commemorate St. Cuthbert. The Book of Kells is made, we don't actually know exactly where the Book of Kells is made, but it's probably made in Ireland and brought to England. That might not be true. The Book of Kells is sometimes associated with the monastery at Iona, which is a small monastery, again, on an island, except it's off the coast of the island of Skye in Scotland. It's actually an astonishing location. But perhaps the text was produced there. We're not totally sure the entire thing was produced. But again, associated with Irish influence in England. The Lindisfarne Gospels also has some of that Irish influence. But you can see in what they're producing that these are gospel books produced in a very different style than any Roman production or any Roman art that we have. It's very localized in a sense, and owes as much to the pagan artistic production that we see at Sutton Hoo than it does to any Roman models. And this is something that sticks with the English church for a long time. And it's probable that the openness of Gregory the Great allows this to be a hallmark of the English church going on for a very long time. On this page you have, against the Book of Kells, you can see this is the title page again from Bede's History of the English People. You can see similar knotworks. This is not nearly as elaborate, obviously, as the Book of Kells, but of course it's just a history, it's not the Bible, so it doesn't have to be as elaborate. But you can see similar sets of knotwork and some of the same patterns. And if you look at the text, the way the letters are written is also quite similar. And actually, if you compare Bede to the Lindisfarne Gospels, you see these similar capital forms. So if you look at the letters just below that first capital, the capital letters that are in little blocks of red, white, and green, they have that same sort of knotty work that you get in a lot of the capitals of the Lindisfarne Gospels themselves. So that's the conversion of England. That's a description of one way in which we can ask who is getting converted, what is the difference between the Irish church and the English church, how many Christians are there under the Anglo-Saxons, how many of them have already married Christians from different places. With this sort of open conversion, we really have no sense of how many individuals get converted. If a king converts and says, well, okay, we'll use the same shrines, we'll just put a cross in it, how certain are we of the conversion of individuals who go to that place? And the answer is, in some sense, we're not. But it does leave us with a lot of questions. Now, another famous conversion, which gives us a similar story, right? It gives us a similar set both of pre-Christian art becoming part of the new Christian narrative, but also begs the question, when and how and why do people end up converting? Now this one, now we're looking at the gelling runestone and the conversion of Harald Bluetooth. Harald Bluetooth is a king of Denmark. And you see here, this is an obvious Viking-style runestone. It has this Scandinavian-looking knotwork, and this is obviously Christ with the halo and the crucifix, the cruciform halo behind his head that indicates that it's got to be Christ, because saints don't generally get that halo. But it also, the other thing about it is that it has these runes inscribed along the bottom. This is a message prepared by Scandinavians for other Scandinavians, or in this case, Danes specifically. And you can see just how similar it is. This is a 10th century Viking rune stone on the right. And everything about it, except the presence of the Christ figure, looks really similar, right down to on the opposing face from Christ. You see this bird, or perhaps it's a dragon sort of figure that looks quite similar to the dragons inscribed at the top of the other runestone. Now, in the case of Harald Bluetooth, we actually have two directly conflicting stories from chronicle evidence. So one of these chronicles comes from Wittikind of Corvey, another one comes from Adam of Bremen. Wittikind of Corvey is writing during the life of Harald and Otto I, and claims that Harald was converted by a cleric by the name of Papa. So this cleric comes up to convert, a little bit like Augustine of Canterbury. Harald asks him to prove his faith in Christ by carrying a great weight of iron heated in fire without being burned. Now, there's a bunch of ordeal stories, and the ordeal is something that also could be talked about for a fair amount of time, but needless to say, Papa, without hesitation, picks up this chunk of iron, carries it, and miraculously is unburned, and the king sees this and is converted. We know that Papa probably existed. He exists in a handful of other stories. There are other mentions of him in other documents, but nothing related to this event specifically, this miraculous conversion of Harald. In contrast, Adam of Bremen, who was writing 100 years later, he's not the contemporary chronicle, but he mentions nothing of Papa in his History of the Archbishops of Hamburg-Bremen. He finishes his work in 1076, which is about 130 years after the runestone, so presumably Harald Bluetooth has already converted. But he tells a story about Harald going to fight Otto I. This is Otto I, the Holy Roman Emperor, who got mentioned previously, and that Otto I defeats him in battle and forces him to convert. So he is now a subjugated state to the Holy Roman Emperor, and part of being subjugated means going along with the emperor's religion. As I mentioned, you convert the head, you assume everybody else will follow. Now, Bremen Cathedral, where Adam is writing, Adam is a member of the Bremen Cathedral, has strong imperial ties. It's a supporter of the Holy Roman Empire itself. And it's possible that this story is meant to actually bolster the cachet or the importance of the Holy Roman Emperor in Denmark itself. But it clearly goes directly against what Wittikind of Corvey has to say. Now, both of these are possible conversion scenarios. It's also possible that Harald himself might have waffled. Perhaps the Papa event did happen, but then he only sort of adopted Christianity and kept practicing other religions, such that when Otto defeats him, and Otto does defeat him, Denmark does become a client state at one point, that perhaps he's not Christian enough for Otto, even if he was Christian enough for Papa. We don't know, right? We can't say either of those things for certain. The Runestones seems to imply that at least the Papa account might be more accurate. The inscription says, King Harald bade these memorials to be made after Gorm his father and Thera his mother, Harald who had won the whole of Denmark and Norway and turned the Danes to Christianity. Okay, turned the Danes to Christianity. It doesn't mention Papa specifically. Maybe the Papa story happened, maybe it didn't. Impossible to say from just that one inscription. but the inscription also gives Harald the credit for it. So whether there was a priest involved or the Holy Roman Emperor involved, this at least gives him whole credit. Now, one thing that we don't know is if Gyrid Olafsdottir, who was his spouse, we don't know her religious faith, although being named Olafsdottir, I suppose, reduces a little bit the chances that one is Christian compared to being a Merovingian princess, like some of the cases in England. But now here are a couple of other rune stones, also from places in Sweden, from a little further north. And again, these are just a couple more examples of the elision of Christianity into previously existing lives and cultures. On both stones, you see, again, something like the dragon or very elongated bird-like figure. I'm going with dragon based on the one on the on the one on the right there. Woven in these knot patterns to a series of runes, but with a very clear cross, right? A very clear Christian symbol added to a previously pagan art form. So this also looks very much like Gregory's, take it as it is, put a cross on it, and that's Christian enough for us. So you see examples like that all over in these runestones, examples from England, from the Anglo-Saxons. We don't know how Christian that makes the people who actually made these objects. They're clearly familiar with Christianity at this point. We know very little about their theology, although there are some writings that give really fascinating images into what the theology might have looked like. Even Beowulf itself, to some extent, is a good example of this, where Christianity is a part of the text and Christianity is assumed, but it's shot through with lots of pagan assumptions. Other good examples, from England at least, there's a poem called The Dream of the Rood, and the rood is the term for the cross itself, where the speaker in the poem is the cross, and the cross is acting something like an Anglo-Saxon hero. The cross really feels like a Beowulf type figure, but it's describing the crucifixion. Similarly, from Germany, there's again, northern Central Europe, there's a gospel book, which is sort of a gospel book. It's the Heliand. It's sometimes called the Saxon Gospel, and it's a retelling of the gospel narrative, but in a very Germanic form. And if you read it, it's recognizable as a gospel, but it is not one of the four canonical gospels. It's been retold in this northern hero story, again, not unlike the better known character of Beowulf. And both of those give you a really good example of a Roman Christianity being really adapted and changed by its movement north and its affiliate and its absorption into new groups who are maintaining much of what they previously thought. And it's under larger leaders later on. The Synod of Whitby is one example of this from the Venerable Bede. Charlemagne himself would be another good example, where the decision is made by northern groups to actually become more Roman and try to get rid of the cultural artifacts that make Christianity look more peculiarly Frankish or Saxon or Scandinavian or Anglo-Saxon or whichever group it is that we're talking about, or Irish in the case of the Book of Kells. There's a missionary sent out named Boniface, sent out during the time of Charlemagne, and he goes to preach. He goes to preach to the Saxons. Now the Saxons are at this point regularly at war with the Franks, and it's actually Charlemagne who destroys their independence and eventually conquers the Saxons, makes them pay him tribute, and they are, quote-unquote, converted to Catholicism. But one wonders, with these runestones and with texts like the Saxon Gospel, the Heliand, it seems much more likely, and Boniface's letters sometimes bear this out. He writes back to the Pope and says, well, they're not Christian. I need to convert them, and if not, they need to be dealt with forcefully. And the Pope says, well, how are they not Christian? And Boniface occasionally says in his letters, well, they aren't saying Mass quite right. And you think, well, wait a minute, they're saying Mass. So how not Christian do you want them to be exactly? It's clear that he is meeting Christians in his missionary efforts, and sometimes he declares them not Christian enough. He, of course, is associated with the Carolingian throne and Frankish imperial power. So there's a sense in which them not being good enough Christians is a good excuse to go conquer them. It's sometimes described, actually, that the Pope tells Charlemagne that he can convert the Saxons by force. There's no direct proof of that, and Boniface actually, the stories that Boniface tells show how muddy that might be. But this could be a good instance of somebody not being as flexible as Gregory the Great, right? Boniface has a narrower view of what it means to have converted, and perhaps the Saxons really aren't up to snuff. This might just not be just political rhetoric, but it might actually be where he thinks people should be as Christians. So I hope that gives a sort of broad sense of the different ways, both that some northern peoples ended up converting to Christianity, but also why that's a complicated question, and one that as scholars is interesting, but also thinking about modern churches is interesting. Where are the boundaries between both different groups of Christians, what it means to have converted? How are we certain that a people belongs to one church or another, particularly before sort of the individual confession idea of Christianity? So Anglo-Saxon England, a little bit about the Saxon Gospels, the Dream of the Rood, and these writings, and on the Runestones from Denmark and Sweden, and some of the Gospel books that we see from Ireland. We see a wide variety of cultural expressions of what I at least think in many cases we have to assume is a form of Christianity. Certainly it's a familiarity with Christianity, and often it is a self-proclaimed, meaning that the people doing it, right? In the case of a gospel book, the Book of Kells, they clearly believe they're Catholic, and while it is a culturally very different Catholic, it's one that we clearly would also ascribe to them. So that's my discussion of conversion in the North, some of the difficulties of conversion. I hope that was enjoyable.